My name is Abby Van Dam, and I have been on the Inclusive Practices Support Specialist team for the past 2 years. And prior to being on this team, I taught special education both in Boston and in Washington, D.C., and actually in New York City for a year.
Hi, I'm Lauren Tuccio. I've been on this team for the past 2 years as well. I've been in special education since I started my career in Boston about 14 years ago.
My name's Annie Tran. This is my fourth year in BPS and my fourth year on this team. I spent the first 2 years as an inclusive practices community field coordinator, and the past 2 years I've been on this team as the inclusive practices support specialist.
Hi, I'm Avril DePaglia. This is my third year on the Inclusive Practices Support Specialist team. Before that, I was at the Murphy School as the strand specialist for the multiple disabilities, vision, and inclusion strands. And before that, I was in Brookline as a substantially separate teacher for 7 years.
Hi, my name is Brendan Donovan. This is my first year on the team. Prior to this, I've been involved with BPS since third grade as a student. But in 2002, I was a school police officer for 3 years, and then I started teaching special ed in 2005, and I've been at the Jeremiah Burke and Community Academy.
We are part of the Inclusive Practices Specialist Support Team for the Office of Special Education, and we're going to present this PD to you. We also have a Google Classroom attached. The code is in the upper left-hand corner, so that's where you're going to be able to find resources and some of the activities listed throughout the presentation.
So here are our objectives. By the end of this session, you are going to be able to discuss importance of people first language and plan ways to incorporate it into your practice. Develop a shared understanding of the definition of inclusive practices and reflect on opportunities to support teachers in creating inclusive classrooms. And you'll be able to develop a clear understanding of the difference between accommodations and modifications. Here's our essential question. During this professional development, we would love for you to always be thinking about the essential question and how you can connect this work to your day-to-day within the Boston Public Schools. The question is, how can you develop an inclusive classroom that is culturally and linguistically responsive through a shared understanding of inclusive practices, given the current educational setting that teachers are utilizing or being asked to utilize? Again, we know this is a loaded question, but we want you to try to connect it to your day-to-day work within Boston Public Schools. So what's on the agenda for today? We are going to start by learning about people first language. Then we're going to move on into a shared understanding of inclusive practices. And lastly, we're going to discuss accommodations and modifications.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for giving us an introduction. So first, we're going to start off by talking about really understanding students with disabilities using what we call people first language. So the goal for this section of the presentation is that participants will be able to discuss the importance of people first language and plan ways to incorporate it into their practice. See the person, not the disability. So I want everybody to take a moment right now. If it helps to jot down your thoughts and ideas, feel free to do so. If it helps for you to just kind of take a moment and pause and think about this question, that's also fine. Really what we'd like you to do is think about what you already know about people first language. Can you think of examples of people first language? Can you think of situations where you've heard individuals not use people first language? And just think about kind of what those experiences have felt like to you and to those around you, maybe your students or your students' families. So I'll take a moment and let everybody think about that. Feel free to keep writing or thinking, but ultimately we really want to just get across the message that people first language puts the person before the disability. And this describes what a person has, not who a person is. Okay, and we're going to move on.
So why is it important to use people first language? To reiterate what Abby just said, you as an educator want to see the person first rather than the disability. So pause this video right now, and then click the video, and then to watch how you as an educator can change the way fellow educators and yourself talk about disabilities. So with the theme of seeing the person, not the disability, the first link is another short video to reiterate why we should be using people first language in our practices. So for the pre-work with people first language is in the Google Classroom. Each person should go through each of these web links, whether it's a handout or an article. All of them are brief. So once you've quickly gone through each of the links, please briefly discuss your findings in the Google form with a link attached here and in the Google Classroom to discuss any findings that you've come across. What surprised you? What didn't surprise you? What takeaways can you use to deepen your awareness on using people first language in inclusive practices?
Okay, so let's take a look at this list of terms and descriptions below. And I'm gonna, again, give everyone time to look through the list and kind of think about which ones would be considered people first and which wouldn't. We'll give everybody a moment to kind of look through, and then we'll go through each one. Okay, so we'll start off with the first bullet, which is students with disabilities. So this is an example of people first language, put students first, and then says that they have disabilities. So remember, going back to that key point that people first language involves what individuals have, not what they are. The second bullet, wheelchair users, is not people first because it's again, kind of putting that disability, putting the idea of the wheelchair first. So you might change that to say like an individual that uses a wheelchair. The next bullet point, the disabled, is not people first. You might say, again, an individual who has a disability. Next bullet, a mentally retarded child is definitely not people first. In addition, we now use the term intellectually disabled to refer to students who were formerly, or individuals who were formerly referred to as having mental retardation. So you might say a child with an intellectual disability. Individuals with autism is people first. Okay, the next bullet point is the deaf person. at first looking at this, first time looking at this, it appears that it's not people first language. It puts deaf first, which is the disability, but actually within the community of deaf individuals, the term big D, which refers to essentially a capital D, big D deaf first people, is considered people first language. And that's an identity that that specific community has created for themselves and owned. The next bullet point, crippled students, again, is not people first. I think for the last kind of section of these bullets, I'm going to move through a little bit quicker. An adult who suffers from cerebral palsy, that is people first. An epileptic is not. So think about, I'd love for you all to think about ways that you would be able to change that. A student with a speech impairment is people first. A child with a visual impairment is people first. A developmentally delayed toddler is not using people first language. Again, I'd like you to think about how you could change that. A hearing impaired infant is not people first. And a student with ADHD is people first.
So the next topic we're going to go into is a shared understanding of inclusive practices. The goal of section 2 is that we hope that you will develop a shared understanding of the definition of inclusive practices and be able to reflect on opportunities to support teachers in creating inclusive classrooms all over Boston.
Thanks. So for our first part, I'd like you to think about how would you define inclusive practices? You could take a few moments, jot down some ideas, and just take a minute to think about it. Where have you seen them? Where have you not seen them? What have you noticed about inclusive practices? Okay, so now that you may have some ideas jot down, let's go to the actual definition of what it means. So inclusive practice refers to the instructional, behavioral strategies that improve both academic and social emotional outcomes for all students, students with and without disabilities in a general education setting. So we have to think about that inclusive practice is just not for our students with disabilities. It's a practice that is a way to include everyone within a general education setting. This reference comes from the Educator Effectiveness Guidebook for Inclusive Practices, which is a very large book that has a lot of good resources and recommendations of ways you can incorporate inclusive practice into there. And we're going to pull some of these out in the following slides. Okay, so again, we just came up with what the actual definition is, but what do you think it takes to make an effective inclusive classroom? What would that look like? What would it sound like? What would the classroom environment and culture feel like? And you could think of that through the lens of the student, through the teacher, or as a school community. So what I'd like for you to do is to click on the Padlet and then fill it in. They're under the different columns that are there, some of your ideas. And you could also pause this while you do that. Okay, so now that you've come up with some ideas of what you might think an effective inclusive classroom might look like and feel like and what the culture might be like, here is a clip from the Swift Domains, and they have actually featured the Henderson School as an example of having inclusive practices. So while you're watching this videos, I want you to think of what are the ways that the principal, the teachers, and the students create an inclusive school community. Take a minute and pause, watch the video, and then come back. Okay. So this is part of the Effective Educator Manual that talks about different indicators to be looking for. And like I said, for the educator, the student, and the classroom, you might notice some of the things from the Henderson video are clearly displayed in some of these bullet points. Some might not. Some of the things you said when you came up with what an inclusive classroom might feel like might be in there. We want to take a look at some of the ways that adults are collaborating with everybody who's in the classroom, not the service-related providers, the ABA people who come in, and be able to work with them and utilize all their talents. We also, not a lot of people always think about the actual environment of the classroom. So, we want to be safe and respectful for all cultures and backgrounds. We want to make sure that we're providing opportunities for our students to collaborate just as much as we're collaborating with others. Another thing is, how is your classroom set up? What are you thinking about so that students can transition and move around the classroom with ease and not have any obstacles or barriers in the way? I mean, now this is a little different that we are doing things virtually. So you might want to start thinking about how for next year, if we are, how that's going to look, and also how can you create these opportunities in this virtual environment. So thinking about some of these guiding probes that I'm sure people who you are mentoring have been dealing with. How do you engage those hard to reach students? What are you doing to get them engaged into the Zoom lessons, the Google Meets, whatever that classroom work is? And again, thinking about not just the students who are those hard to reach, but what about those students who are excelling at this? Like, how are you challenging them in all of it? I know that during the Zoom videos, there are some challenging behaviors that might happen that are out of our control, but what are some of the things that you could do to put some behavioral and routines within your Zoom meetings? As we're moving on in this virtual learning and thinking ahead for next year, what are some interventions and supports that you need as well as the students need in order to be effective in this classroom? What kind of data are we going to be using? I know we are being asked to do some assessments, but like, what are you guiding your students on and learning, understanding what their learning is of the topics that you are providing to them? And then thinking as you're teaching, where are those big hurdles? What's everybody having big trouble with? And then how do we address those? And then what ways do some students might need that more targeted support? You could always think about how are we going to utilize the UDL, which we'll be talking a little bit about later. How do we utilize that in this virtual setting as well?
So having an inclusive classroom is extremely important. One of the reasons it is that we don't want to lead to disproportionality. The definition, as you see right here, the disproportionality is defined as overrepresentation and underrepresentation of a particular population or demographic group in special or gifted education programs relative to the presence of the group in the overall student population. So disproportionality is a huge issue in the United States. Disproportionate representation of culturally and linguistically diverse students in special education programs has been a national concern for over 40 years. African American students, especially males, have been overrepresented in special education, specifically when you think of specific learning disability and emotional impairment. Asian and Pacific Islander students are less likely to be identified for special education, but are overrepresented in gifted and talented programs. And English language learners are more likely to receive special ed services in school districts that are smaller, that have smaller ELL populations than larger districts. Next, we have two articles on disproportionality. If your last name begins with A to M, as in Michael, so Apple to Michael, you're going to read this article that comes from Education Week. It's called Keeping Special Education in Proportion. This article discusses what schools can do to have improvement on instructional cultures. Some of the suggestions it makes are it surrounds data, fixing professional development, opening up to difficult conversations with your students and within staff, and healing the curriculum. If your last name begins with N, as in Nancy, to Z to zebra, again, N to Z, You're going to read the article from the National Education Association, Truth in Labeling, Disproportionality in Special Education. This article discusses what leads to disproportionality, how to change current practices, and gives several examples of why teachers refer students to special education. So after you complete the reading, please complete the Padlet activity. Please use this Padlet to write one sentence, phrase, or word that stuck out while reading the article. After that, I just want you to explain your thinking. What were you thinking? Was it a statistic? Was it a word? Why did you think that? And pause the video now. You can go do that and then press play when you're ready to come back to the presentation. The Boston Public Schools is committed to meeting the needs of all students, including students with special needs, and supports their right to be educated in the least restrictive environment. They should always be placed in the least restrictive environment. This means that they are to be included in general education settings as much as possible. This could look different from student to student. Removal from a general education class, placement in an alternative class, and/or placement in a different school should only happen when the severity of the student's disability is such that supplementary services and/or aids cannot provide an appropriate education. According to research, students with special needs, especially those with mild to moderate special needs, achieve at higher levels in standardized testing such as the MCAS when effectively taught in an inclusive setting. What does this look like? How are full inclusion, partial inclusion, and substantially separate defined? Well, full inclusion is when students are inside the general education classroom 80% or more of the day. Partial inclusion is inside the general education classroom 40 to 79% of the day. And substantially separate is inside general education classroom less than 40% of the day. How does this relate to Boston? So these are statistics from the Boston Public Schools for last school year, so 2018, 2019. We have about 54,000 students in Boston, 11,500 students with disabilities. Out of those students, 51% are in full inclusion, 10.7% are in partial inclusion, and 30.7% are in substantially separate classrooms. So there's 8% left over, and they're enrolled in special schools, in public or private, or one of our 6 BPS day schools.
Okay, so now that we've talked about people first language and we have sort of a generalized understanding of inclusive practices, the next step is sort of looking through accommodations and modifications. So in this section, we're hoping that you get like a clear understanding of the difference between these two things, these two types of adaptations, which is the bigger umbrella, and then sort of how we can use them to make our learning environments more inclusive. So if you have students who have individualized education programs, there is this page called, people often call it the PLET page, which is the present levels of educational performance. So in the top part, students, the educational team will check off for students what areas the disability impacts. And then right below it says, how does the disability affect progress in these curriculum areas? So the educational team will say how the student's disability impacts those areas. The next section, it says what types of accommodations, if any, are necessary for the student to make effective progress. And that's where you're going to see accommodations, which we'll talk about in the following slides. Right below that, though, it says what type of specially designed instruction, if any, is necessary for the student to make effective progress. That's the modification section. So on this page, on the PLET page, And there's two of them. There's A for general education, and then the page after that is B, which is other areas that are not covered by these general curriculum areas. That's where in a student's ed plan, you'll find both accommodations that they might need and modifications. So they're two very different things. They're both adaptations, but accommodations are adaptations that keep a student on grade level and allow a student to access the general education curriculum still. Accommodations offer a change in timing, scheduling, response, presentation, and setting. So on the next slide, we'll sort of parse out what each of those things means. So accommodations in the area of timing, scheduling, it's what a student might need to complete a task. So a student might need more time to complete a task. A student might need work presented in smaller chunks. Response, a student needs the following response accommodations, things like access to speech to text. A student might need a picture exchange communication board. A student might need to be able to, let's see, draw along with their writing. Presentation, a student needs the following presentation accommodations, things such as lined paper, access to braille text, large print for all materials. It's sort of how we give materials to a student. And then setting, a student needs the following setting accommodations, close proximity to the teacher, test taking in small groups. These are still things that don't take a student off of grade level, but they give a student access into the general education curriculum. So linked in this slide presentation are more examples of accommodations, and they're sort of written on a paper of something that I had received from a professor a long time ago. So it looks kind of, you can tell that it's scanned in, but that it's an old printout, and it's written as adaptations. So some of the things on that page are accommodations and some are modifications, and I sort of tried to blur some of them out. But examples of some of these accommodations for timing and scheduling, things that you might see on that PLET page are allowing additional time to complete word work, extra time to process information. And these are things that you could provide to all students because they're not just great for students who have different disabilities. Examples of response accommodations could be things like sentence starters, giving students different ways to respond orally, or using Google Read and Write instead of in person at the desk writing. Different setting accommodations could be things like, again, that preferential seating. We see that sometimes in ed plans, but that might mean sitting close to the teacher. That might mean sitting close to the door or close to the bathroom. And then another setting accommodation that we often see is allowing a student to select where they're working, a standalone desk maybe, or a different work area when that's appropriate for your classroom. So this is something that when I was a mentor, we definitely talked about, my mentee and I, often what's an accommodation versus a modification. And these were some of the things that we look towards. Presentation is the one, at least on IEPs, that you tend to see filled up. So that could be things like simplifying written text, simplifying your directions, making your directions in small steps. Presentation really focuses on how are we as educators bringing these materials to children. And if it's a part of an IEP, it's even more like, how are we as educators presenting these this curriculum to this particular child. So those are really important things to kind of pull off the page. Another thing you'll see, clear and concise presentation of materials and information, or be clear and concise when you use visual supports and modeling, especially for our students with visual impairments. And then being very clear and concise about your rules and expectations. Setting those up at the beginning of the year, having them posted, having it be something that's referred to often is useful for all students, not just children with disabilities. And then finally, educator provides verbal prompts and visual cues when delivering information. These are all things, again, that are wonderful for students with and without disabilities, which is really the point of inclusive practices and bringing those into your classroom and really talking to your mentee about bringing those into their classrooms. So we have under adaptations, we have accommodations, which don't take a student off of grade level and are used as access points into the gen ed curriculum. And modifications are specially designed instruction. Modifications are not things that students without educational plans have. So if a student has an IEP, they have some sort of specially designed instruction in that. And again, that's on the PLEP page that was at the very beginning of this section. So modifications fall into 3 categories. There's content, what needs to be taught to the student. That's, you know, if you have a student with mild to moderate disabilities, it could be instruction is given at their particular instructional level, and that might be a different reading level. That might be 1 or 2 grades below the grade level that they're currently in. Methodology is how the student's going to be taught. That's where you'll see things like small group, could be push-in, it could be pull-out. And I think methodology, and somebody can jump in if you want to, that is also where we put if a student receives, like that's where you'll see if a student receives explicit rules-based reading instruction. And then performance criteria. This is another big one. So our students who have IEPs, they will have things like progress reports put into that section. So performance criteria is the ways that we're going to measure this particular student's progress and achievement. And for a very small slice of our population, those students take the MCAS alternative assessment portfolio. That's a very small number of the students in Boston, but that will be put into that section. And that's where teams often rate things like, you know, narrative data, benchmarking, like F&P benchmarking, things to that effect. So this slide goes back to what Lauren was talking about previously. What are some accommodation and modification look fors in your classroom? So you can take a minute to kind of read through these and peek at that, but she definitely went into it further than I will when she had you watch the video and sort of think about it through there. So the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education laid out some of the things that they thought were really important in effective inclusive classrooms. And they looked at it by educator, by student, and the physical space. So this, I won't read it to you, but this is a really great opportunity to take a look, think about it, think about what has worked in your classroom, and then think about how you could bring this to your mentee as a tool to sort of create conversations. So for this slide, we would love it if you could share some of your thoughts. So the question that we're asking you is, what are some virtual accommodations and modifications that have been successful in your remote learning experience? So in the last slide, you sort of started to think about accommodations that might be useful or that you might be using in your physical classroom. But now we'd like you to sort of consider virtually what has been working with the students that you have. So how have you been able to, using accommodations, make things more inclusive for your students? Maybe they're students with disabilities, maybe they're not. Maybe they're just students who are having a really tough time staying focused during your Zoom meetings. Anyway, if you could share, you're going to click on that link, and the password is Boston with a capital B 2020 and then an exclamation point, and that'll take you right into the Flipgrid. If you've ever used Flipgrid before, it's kind of neat. It allows you to record a video. I'm not sure if you can turn your background off. I'll have to look, but you can record a video and just kind of tell us 1 or 2 things that have been really successful with your remote learning spaces. What are some accommodations that you use? Feel free to go back in the slides and kind of think through them and just share a little teeny sound bite. It could be 10 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. Our team sort of pulled together some different resources that we found on how you could support your teachers and even your families with accommodations and modifications virtually right now. So there's some online learning resources, and all those, the things that are underlined are hyperlinks. So the OIIT webinars have been awesome, and they have everything from Zoom facilitation to, trying to think of another one that I watched, how to engage learners virtually. They just have a lot of resources, and they show you how to use any of the tools that are in the digital backpack. So that's great, which includes Google Read and Write. Rhiannon Gutierrez does a million things with Google Read and Write, and she has some great webinars up that sort of teach you how to use it and how you can share it with students who might need those accommodations. BPS SpedPack is wonderful resource for families and for parents. Another thing that we're sort of trying to figure out is how to engage students who are not logging into Google Classrooms. Should teachers, or could your mentee do more texting, calling? I've seen people set up like fun Friday games where they sent something out to all the parents or to all the guardians, and got all the kids to log in at 1 p.m. on a Friday and just played like Pictionary with them. It was really cute. For students who have some executive functioning challenges, there's adaptations out there, things like creating schedules, and we put examples of an elementary and a middle school schedule up for you. Different tips for students who might have ADHD, and then what would a daily work checklist look like? Maybe your mentee or you are working with families who are like really struggling to get something out for kids. That's an example of one that you could print out. If people don't have a printer, you could sort of just write it. And same thing with setting a timer for work activities. Those are all online timers that are free to use. You may have talked with your mentee about the Universal Design for Learning, UDL, or you may have heard it. These are hyperlinks. So the quick overview is a video, and then the actual UDL guidelines are, if you click them, they will open up to the interactive version that's on the website. And that is what we have used often in creating not only this presentation, but creating our own classrooms. When we work with teachers to create more inclusive opportunities, this is sort of what we're referring back to. And it helps us kind of barrier plan, sort of how to engage kids, how we can represent things to them, and then how we're asking them to show their learning. So it's a really neat way to kind of think about lesson planning, or think about your physical space, think about your virtual space. And it's also a really neat website just to kind of navigate around and see some of the things that other people have thought of.
So a lot of what we've talked about today are things to keep in mind during a normal school year and in a physical classroom where you actually have students physically in front of you. But we also want to keep in mind that these are unprecedented times, and we're all navigating the world of virtual learning and virtual communication with our students and families. So as you continue to plan for virtual learning with UDL in mind, these are some tips that we just wanted to quickly outline that will kind of help you think about applying UDL, Universal Design for Learning, in virtual situations. So really thinking about explicitly teaching expectations for engagement. That's something we would do in a physical classroom, but is also important when you're online. So really letting kids know what the expectations are. Should they be holding their cell phone or watching TV while they're also tuned into the lesson, or are you going to kind of outline a very clear set of expectations so they really know what's appropriate and what's not? Allow for asynchronous learning. So not everybody is going to be able to perform well when they are, in front of a camera or in front of their class. So allowing for opportunities for students to kind of do things offline. Assign different note takers, make materials accessible. That might be online via email, or it might be actually, distributing actual materials, tangible materials. Embrace your students as teachers. A lot of times our kids know more about technology than we do. And actively build a supportive community.
I think one thing that we could add into building a supportive community is that we have to think of the social emotional needs of our students as well. That's a really important part of inclusive practices. It's not just the academics, it's also about that social emotional. So maybe you're not doing academics every Zoom meeting that you're doing. Maybe you're doing a second step lesson and a restorative justice lesson, an open circle, whatever it may be, to engage your students, but also to address the social emotional. You know, a lot of our kids come from very different backgrounds, have very different family lives and in different communities. So we want to be able to support that. And not every kid's going to be able to do that academically. So we just want to keep that in mind.
Great. And then 6 strategies for online teaching that are aligned with UDL. When we think about engagement is really, really tough under any circumstance, but especially now. And districts all over the state and the country are struggling to keep kids and families engaged and excited about learning. I'm sure that there are so many teachers who have so many awesome ways to keep their students and their families engaged. Just at a very basic level, really keeping communication going with students, like a weekly written communication to students via emails or via text messages or even via phone calls is really important. In terms of representation, the teachers should be thinking about posting flexible presentations. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in here around kind of what that could look like or what that means.
I think something similar to this would be a way for kids to learn. The OIT webinars have like hyperlinks, especially for the older kids, but they even put it in for how you could engage the students with a Google Slides where they're, you know, sorting things so that it's not always just that front facing me teaching the classroom, but it's also how am I getting students to be able to engage with the materials and the curriculum that I'm presenting.
And in terms of accessibility of digital materials, there are a lot of barriers here. And you know, teachers, we all really need to be thinking about how accessible materials are. And in many cases, I know of a lot of students or teachers throughout the district who are actually hand delivering tangible materials, printed out materials or activities to their classrooms and to their students. Because for so many of us, for so many students with and without disabilities, doing everything online is really difficult. I know for me, like I'm a person that really prefers to hold an actual book in my hand, and when I start to read online, it's really challenging for me. So I think that's a really, really big piece that we're seeing as a barrier here. And finally, for action and expression, we really also need to be creative and thinking about how we want students to present knowledge back to us. We think a lot about, and we've had to learn really, really quickly how to give information out to our students during this time. But it's also important to think about flexibility in terms of how students are responding. So we tried in this presentation to get a little creative. It's not, you know, we're not just asking for people to kind of respond in voice or in taking notes or in writing, but also, you know, putting in a Padlet and allowing for individuals to type in or allowing for individuals to tune in via the screen and give their answers that way. Some students might work best to call you up on the phone and give their responses or their work that way, to present their work that way.
So the racial equity tool is something that has been presented to our team pretty recently. We just had a training on it about 2 weeks ago. And it's really a way to think about how we are engaging with the stakeholders that are at our table. So look around who's sitting with you when you are planning, whether it's PD, a project, some sort of presentation, but also to think about a little bit about the curriculum as well that we're putting in front of students. Like, who are the stakeholders? How are we getting families engaged? What are we doing to close those opportunity and achievement gaps that we have? And there will be 2 more trainings sometime in June. We don't have the exact dates as of yet. But there's a COVID-19 tool that you could use to look at. It's just really to get you to start thinking about how we could have some equity across the district and, you know, the virtual learning experience.
Thank you all so much for joining us today for this presentation. And we also really, really want to thank the new teacher developers team for inviting us to present this to you all. We would love to hear any of your questions or any feedback, how we could clarify anything better or make this presentation better. If you want to reach out to us via the Padlet, you can click on the word questions. That's a hyperlink, and that will take you to the Padlet where you can type in your questions, your concerns, your feedback. If you want a specific response, just including your email address would be great. And also feel free to email any of us. Our email addresses are below. If you have specific questions about our individual portions of the presentation, you can email us individually or as a team. And we will also be emailing out a feedback form as well.
And just one other note is that the Google Classroom is the way we are going to be able to take attendance. So participating in some of the links and readings and articles will be a way that we know that you have completed it to pass on to the new teacher developers.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.